Hello, my name's Nick Thody. I'm the Head of Knowledge at Osborne Clarke, and I'm joined today by Catherine Hammon, our Digital Revolution Knowledge Lawyer, and we're going to continue our conversation about the blockchain. So, Catherine, in our first discussion of the blockchain or blockchain, we really talked about how it worked, the sort of theoretical underpinnings of it, how Bitcoin in particular is mined, and how transfers of Bitcoin take place. And we kind of also noticed that the blockchain is not the same as Bitcoin. So just continuing the sort of move to the actual practical applications of blockchain technology, can you give us an overview now of what sort of applications blockchain is being used for in business?
Yeah, so it started with Bitcoin, as you say, which is a cryptocurrency. One of the main sectors which is investigating blockchain applications is the financial services sector. There's a really interesting statistic that the Financial Conduct Authority's sandbox, which is a sort of zone in which startups and things can try out innovative technologies, innovative applications within the financial regulatory sphere with guidance, etc. Almost half of the projects which have been through the sandbox so far are blockchain technologies. Even though there's a lot of concern in some respects about blockchain, cryptocurrencies, etc., there's also a lot of interest, and the financial institutions themselves recognise that it has the potential to hugely disrupt the way that they do things and the potential to hugely improve the way they do things. And so they, as much as anybody else, are interested in how blockchain can be used in the financial services sector. Another really strong potential application is in relation to supply chains. So where you have products which are travelling long distances, which have got to go through numerous customs processes, etc., the blockchain can really help with smoothing out, making sure that the documentation is available, accessible, that authorizations are recorded, that consents go onto the blockchain. You can track where the goods have got to, perhaps. You've got visibility through the blockchain of the sequence of movement, the shipping movements, etc., etc. If you add Internet of Things type sensors, etc., to your cargo, you can also see things like the temperature, the atmospherics, the humidity that these products have been through as they've gone on their journey around the world, which for some products is obviously really important. So you can have visibility of that, and all of that data can get put into the blockchain, locked down. Everyone can see it. You can't tamper with it, etc., etc. Closely related to that, the food industry is really interested in blockchain applications. It can help with things like provenance. So there are projects to trace how quickly you can trace back where your mangoes came from. So that can be, for example, if you have a food safety issue, sometimes being able to really quickly understand where that issue has come from, which product it might have come from, can be really important because it can help to focus where you need to take your response. Other industries like the diamond industry, where provenance is very important, there's investigations and projects going on around blockchain in those sectors. Another really important area is around identity. So ways of locking down data so that it's secure, can't be tampered with, but is also very visible. So all sorts of applications for that kind of thing. If you're in a sector where there's a sort of gig economy type structure where workers are moving from one employer to the next very swiftly, it can be really useful to have readily accessible, verified proof that they are who they say they are, they've got the professional qualifications they say they are, etc., etc. You could even put your CV on a blockchain, and then if you're applying for a new job, you can have all your certification, etc., on the blockchain. It can be readily accessed. And also the public services sector are looking at it as well. So there's some really interesting potential for centralised services to be put on the blockchain, not necessarily becoming decentralised, but at least becoming very easily accessible, very locked down, very secure, etc., etc. So there's even talk about, for example, putting land registry records onto a blockchain, which is a really nice one. You've got this lovely juxtaposition again of ancient titles, the oldest form, one of the oldest forms of law on this brand new technology. So there's all sorts of wide potential applications.
Okay, so I mean, you can see that one can see that although it started in the financial services sector, in fact it's really going to be, or could be of application in any sector that needs verifiable, centrally locked down data change that can be investigated. So it's obvious there's a lot of potential there. I think one area where blockchain has gained an enormous amount of attention in the past couple of years is the rise of cryptocurrencies, which is really where Bitcoin started as the original cryptocurrencies. But I think in recent months there's been quite a lot of adverse publicity for some of these. And can you just talk us through some of the issues that are starting to crop up as potential problems?
Yeah, so you're right. Bitcoin, where this all began, is a cryptocurrency. The idea was that it was a way to exchange value. But having said that, it's not a currency in the sense that it doesn't have anything underneath it. It doesn't have gold at the beginning of the chain. It doesn't have a bank at the beginning of the chain. There's no I promise to pay by the Bank of England on your, or by anybody on your Bitcoin. These are products which have value because the system believes that they have value. If I want to transfer my Bitcoin back into ordinary fiat currency, I need to find someone who's prepared to give me some pounds or some dollars in exchange for my Bitcoin because they believe it's worth whatever it is they're going to pay for it. Now, many people see cryptocurrencies as actually being more of an asset than a currency for those reasons, because there is nothing underlying the value of them. Their value is based on market sentiment, essentially. There's also a huge amount of volatility in the value of these things. They are very speculative. Bitcoin you can actually use like a traditional currency in some places, not many places in the UK, but in the US there are more places perhaps which accept Bitcoin. You can use your Bitcoin wallet literally to directly pay, but that is not widespread. That's certainly not widespread. So the cryptocurrencies themselves, it slightly depends on which one you're talking about. Bitcoin can be used more like a form of money, but it's still more used, to be honest, as a speculative investment.
And of course, I think it's it's only fair and reasonable of us to point out that, of course, fiat currencies that we deal with, the £20 note in our wallet, or the Visa transactions, that is in many ways a concocted currency in the way that Bitcoin is. I mean, it is just a question of belief, whether you believe in the value of the pound sterling or the dollar you have. It's a question of societal acceptance, and so Bitcoin enthusiasts would say they're simply at different stages. I mean, there's no longer any gold or any other standard backing, underlying sterling or the dollar. They're both fundamentally a question. It's a question of trust that underlies both. Another very interesting development, particularly in the past sort of 18 months, is the rise of tokens, which is taking on the coin idea, as I understand it.
Yeah, that's right. So tokens it's another aspect of this idea that the blockchain, you can have all of the Bitcoin elements, you can have some of the Bitcoin elements, you can take the ideas and move them and use them in a different way. So tokens are where you take the coin idea. You can use it as a currency, as Bitcoin considers itself to be. You can use it as an investment asset, as a tradable asset, etc. Or you can just use it a bit like a voucher. It entitles you to something. It entitles you to a product at the end of the day. You can swap it. I've seen one white paper where the token that they were creating, the coin that they were creating, they hoped at some point it might be able to be used like a currency, but in the meantime they were suggesting that you could swap it for Amazon vouchers, for example. So it's more like a sort of voucher in some ways. There are no rules about what these tokens do and don't do. It's how you set them up. And
an ICO then is just when a coin is created.
Yeah, that's right. So an ICO, an initial coin offering, is the first time that a new coin token is created. It can be used as a way of crowdfunding. That's very often what it's all about. So ICOs have become very popular in the startup community because you issue a new coin and then it can be used as a way of gaining money gaining funding towards your venture. ICOs, the token that is created with an ICO is again hugely variable. It could be a new type of currency that they're aiming for. It could be it could be linked to the profitability of the business going forwards, in which case it's more like a security. It could be just like a voucher again. And the regulatory environment around ICOs depends on the rights which are...
And it's fair to say that regulatory environment is a subject of very close attention by regulators, both on a national and international level, in the sense that ICOs plainly have similarities towards the issuance of equities, which is obviously highly regulated, but in some way they're different, and working out what regulatory framework should apply, if any, is a subject of close attention for all regulators. And I think generally they're sort of paying much more close attention and taking action, probably a little bit sooner than people perhaps expected.
Yeah, I think So at the moment, ICOs are assessed on a case-by-case basis. What are the rights attached? But there's a growing expectation amongst the financial regulators that because of the volatility of these products, because of the risk of fraud, basically there is a lot of consumer risk in relation to these products, which are available for anyone to invest in.
Well.
And they're hard to understand. So there's a feeling that exactly, and so there's basically a feeling that regulation is coming. I think there's no doubt about it. The Wild West days of ICOs on any basis, see what happens. That's going. There will be regulation.
So it was a brief but fun for some period. So moving away from the sort of currency and coin aspect to it, and moving back onto grounds where probably some lawyers, including myself, will feel a little bit more comfortable. The blockchain is viewed very much as a useful tool for the development of what are called smart contracts as the sort of key underlying technology for those. Can you just briefly explain to us what a smart contract is or could be?
Yeah, so a smart contract in many ways is a bit of a misnomer because they're not particularly smart. They're very if A then B, and they're not at the moment certainly full contracts. But essentially it's the idea that within the scope of a contract, there will be some elements of the performance of that contract. If this happens, then that will happen. And the idea is that you can lock down those functions into a blockchain so that you can essentially automate it, so that the contract will self-execute, will perform as long as condition A is secured, then it will happen. So, for example, if you can record to the blockchain that payment was received, then you can have coded into the blockchain that if payment is received, then the products will be shipped. And then perhaps if the products are shipped, then the insurance contract to cover the shipping will activate, etc., etc. So you can see that there's aspects of the contract which are if this, then that, if this, then that. And you can lock down that sequencing and the triggering of those elements. You can lock that down into the blockchain so that they become automatic in the way that they happen. And that's essentially what smart contracts are all about.
Okay. And then let's do the bit where we bring this back to the key legal issues. And you've drawn, throughout these talks, you've drawn some quite interesting parallels to actually sort of underlying legal concepts we're quite familiar with, such as tracing chains of title. But a bit like just looking at some of the legal issues around blockchain and coins and smart contracts, firstly, I suppose the question that immediately occurs is what jurisdiction is actually in charge, so to speak, or bites on these activities?
Yeah, it's a bit like blockchain at the moment is a bit like the early days of the internet, where there was some discussion of, well, this thing just exists up there. It doesn't touch down. It's not physical. Therefore, it doesn't touch down in any jurisdiction. So perhaps it's above everything. Perhaps it's above all jurisdictions, and no law bites on it. Of course, we know with the internet the answer to that wasn't nothing touches it. It's everything touches it, or at least wherever that electronic process touches down, whether it's the person creating the platform, whether it's the consumer buying off the platform, whether it's the producer selling off the platform, wherever you touch down into a jurisdiction, potentially the laws
Although
bite.
It's taken 20 years for us really, and regulators to really start to get a grip and get their arms around those issues. So I guess we're a long way further back.
Well, except that we already know how the internet turned out, so the regulators, but there's less confusion about this. I think perhaps the concept of electronic system or e-systems, e-structures, etc., is much more understood. It just because it's in the ether doesn't mean it's not locked down into jurisdictions. One of the areas where the jurisdictional issue does bite very particularly is where you have disputes. So the blockchain system is decentralized. You don't have a single body to say, well, this is so-and-so's system. This comes from this entity, and this entity was established in this jurisdiction. So at least we could start there. It's a distributed system. It's a decentralized system. So one of the issues can be if a dispute arises in a smart contract context, perhaps, which jurisdiction is the one where you should, which court of which jurisdiction should you go to, which law applies, that kind of thing applies. Sometimes there will be governing contracts around these things, around access to these things, which answer those questions, and sometimes there won't be. So there is the potential still for that sort of jurisdictional issue to certainly bite.
And then, unfortunately, I'm going to have to use the D word. If this is digital, it must be
data.
So there are some obvious data issues around all of this.
Yeah, there are obvious data issues. Blockchain is a data and software structure, so it's all about data. The general data protection regulation, data privacy, etc., if there is personal data, sensitive data being put into the blockchain, then all of that regulation kicks in. There are some very obvious problems with blockchain and data protection rules. So, for example, the right to rectification. How do you correct something if it's locked down? How do you have the right to be forgotten if your data is locked into the blockchain, and if you delete it, the blockchain will disintegrate, etc., etc.? There are obvious problems like that around it. So data is very much an issue in relation to the blockchain, and there are ways to achieve all of this, but it can take some careful thought. As with so much technology, so much of this new technology, particularly where it's facilitating automation, you really need to think about these things right at the outset to make sure that you structure the software in such a way that you are complying, and you will be able to comply going forward with the regulation which will affect it.
And then finally, as we've touched on with initial coin offerings and cryptocurrencies, they have quasi-security type features, so all that sort of ambit and environment of securities law is going to start to bite. And I think initially there was some head scratching by the regulators, but I think they've probably fitted it to some extent into a theoretical framework they're familiar with, and at the moment I think they're still unregulated in the US and the UK. But moving to regulated status, or
yes, certainly in the UK, I think there's no doubt the Financial Conduct Authority has made comments about it. The Bank of England has made comments about it. As we discussed earlier, there's a feeling that the consumer risk is too high to just let these things carry on unregulated. One of the other aspects of regulation that's coming in from the financial sector, well, not just financial, but with for financial reasons, money laundering. At the moment, those requirements don't apply to the cryptocurrency environment. Some of the cryptocurrency exchanges apply them of their own. They have decided to apply it anyway to support credibility and to make it clear that they're reliable operators, etc. European legislation around money laundering is going through one of its periodic updates at the moment, and it will extend now to cryptocurrency gateways. So the exchanges, etc., will have to do money laundering checks on the people who are gaining Bitcoin wallets, who are buying Bitcoin, etc., etc., or not just Bitcoin, all of the cryptocurrencies. So regulation is slowly coming in.
Yeah. So new concepts, but in some ways familiar
problems. Familiar problems, yeah.
Catherine, that's a fantastic run through of blockchain and many of its different aspects and connotations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.